Okay, so here's my terminal. Obviously, if you're using a Windows, this is the command prompt. We're going to install a few packages before we get started. First thing we're going to install is Webpack globally, like so. So the I stands for install, the -G stands for global. Sudo is for root user. If you're on a Windows machine, you don't need sudo. You can just do npm i-g. This is assuming you already have Node and npm installed. Does anyone not have Node or npm installed? And if not, we can install it right now. It should take 2 minutes. If you do not have Node, just head over here. Make sure you download the LTS, just because it's more stable. And that will give you the proper command line tools. Okay. Next thing we want to install is gulp. Same thing, install that globally. I'm not doing it because I already have it, so I don't need to do it again. All right, last but not least, we're going to install the Turbo CLI. And this is your liaison to your Turbo environment. So when you create a project on Turbo, in order to deploy, you got to use the CLI. Okay. How are we doing so far? Okay. Check your Turbo version by doing this. And you should see that version number or higher. Good? Everyone good? Okay. If anyone has any problems, just raise your hand and we'll stop and get everyone caught up. All right. So what I'm going to do today is create a very, very basic React project from the bottom up. To give it some sort of context, I'm going to make like a job board, kind of like if somebody wants to hire someone to babysit or walk your dog or something like that. Very simple. It's not going to be a real project. I'm not going to deploy or anything like that, but it's going to be a very simple project to demonstrate basic React concepts. As I do more and more React demos this month, intro React demos, I will continue this specific project so that you can come back and pick up from where you left off. But each demo will be self-contained in that you don't have to attend the last one to get to the next one, if that makes any sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on that. I'm going to create a project right now using the Turbo scaffolding engine. Let's call it React demo. Let's call it jobs, like that. Turbo is a Node Express React environment. So what this is going to create is a Node Express project with no React configuration. Now, you can include a flag which will give you a React template out of the box, kind of like create a React app. We're not going to do that today though, because I want to create a React project from the bottom up. Okay, so this is totally from scratch with no React configuration whatsoever. So this will create a Node Express project. Does anyone here not have any experience with Node Express? Okay, so we'll go over the fundamentals of that real quick as well. Okay, so go ahead and create that.
So Turbo 360 is your company?
Correct.
And Turbo is you wrote this client, this CLI?
I did everything on Turbo. It took me a long time, and that's sort of my main focus right now is getting people to use Turbo. I built Turbo about a year ago. I mean, I'll give you some more background at the end of the demo if you want, but I built it about a year ago. It's completely built on top of AWS. It's kind of like Heroku with more features. Yeah, I raised a small round for Turbo a little under a year ago, and now I'm promoting it. That's it. In the meantime, while you're here using Turbo, you will learn as much React as you can handle. So that's how I get these demos going. So what was I saying here? So this is a Node Express project. So if you open this up, good, there we go. Sorry about that. Should have tested this beforehand. Okay. So if you open up your project that you scaffolded, you should see the same thing in the app.js file over there. Do you see that? And this is a very, very sort of primitive Node Express application. It's like the simplest Node Express application you can create. Node Express, if you don't already know, is a backend web framework, kind of like the JavaScript version of Ruby on Rails or Python Django. Then there's Node Express. Those are pretty much the three dominant web frameworks in the industry today. Well, there's also C#, .NET, which is very, very popular. So we're using Node Express, which is the JavaScript-based backend framework for creating web applications. Node Express in particular is not like a React-specific thing, but it jives very well with React because React is JavaScript-based as well. So you're using JavaScript on the front and the back. And in particular, Node Express makes it very conducive for what's called server-side rendering because you have JavaScript on the back end, which then renders on the front end. So this is it fits very well, but it's not specific to React, if that makes any sense. Okay, so are you with me? All this template code right here that's commented out, let's just get rid of it. We're not going to use it. So as you can see, what's left behind is very, very simple. That's what I meant by primitive Node Express application. This is pretty much the least you can write and run a Node Express application, more or less. Okay? These are the routes which will basically handle the incoming HTTP requests and then render the pages. Okay? Is anyone here in a boot camp or have taken a boot camp? Okay, so yeah, Flatiron, you told me, right? So they're doing Rails? Rails, okay. Okay, so if we go back to our terminal and cd into the project, so I believe we called it jobs, we can run the dev server locally by doing turbo dev server. That's going to run a localhost server on your machine where you can. Oh, I forgot to install the package. My mistake. I skipped a step. So inherent in any Node project is to install the dependencies. Okay, and those are defined in what's called the package.json file. So the package.json is right here, and this is where your dependencies are listed out. Okay, and here we have to install them, which we haven't done yet. So let's go ahead and do that real quick by running npm install. And this will download and install all the dependencies. So these are like installing gems in a Ruby project. It's synonymous to that. Does anyone here have experience with any other web framework? Python, Django, Flask? Which ones?
Django and Ruby.
Okay, so you're familiar with the whole MVC style architecture and whatnot. It's a similar idea. Okay, so now we have all the dependencies installed. In Python, these would be pip modules, same idea. So we can run the dev server now. And that runs on localhost 3000, so we're running a localhost server on port 3000. So just head over to localhost 3000, and you should see the scaffold that's generated from the Turbo scaffold. Okay, everyone good so far?
Spinning.
Okay, just let it download and install. And then back in your terminal, to stop the server, you do Control-C, and it kills the server. And I think on Windows it asks you, are you sure you want to stop this process? What OS are you running?
Ubuntu 16%.
Oh, so you're running a Linux distro?
Yeah.
That's strange. It works very well on Linux normally, so.
Yeah, it's just warnings. It's just my server didn't start. Or it didn't say that it started. I can't connect to this.
All right, we'll just,
Yeah,
just block the
let's go
call.
ahead.
Okay. All right, so we have the localhost running, everything looks good. So this is the scaffolded project out of the box. So without doing any coding at all, you get this out of the box. This is called a view template, and this file right here that you're looking at, it resides in the views directory. So if we open that up, views index.mustache is literally the template that we are currently looking at. Mustache is Mustache is a templating engine, which is just a quick and easy way to inject dynamic data into an HTML template. If you need more explanation on that, let me know. But that's not really relevant to React either. So we're going to tear out all this stuff and render our React project. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started with that. So first thing we're going to do, you see where the body tag begins on line 5? Everything within that we're just going to remove, just basically all of it. All the way down to here, you see that on line 86? Let's get rid of all of that. I'm going to leave one script tag behind just for our own reference, so we don't have to memorize like the file paths here. So basically, we should be down to this when we're done. Okay, so we just removed everything. Okay, pretty straightforward. And then let's create a div here. Say my React project. So if we go back to our terminal and run localhost or the dev server, we should now just see my React project. Okay, so that means it worked. Obviously, pretty straightforward. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start creating our React project. So up until now, we obviously haven't done any React, and React is nowhere in this project whatsoever. So let's go ahead and start installing the dependencies and creating the code base which will serve our React project. Okay? There's a handful of dependencies we need to install in order to do that. So first, the -s means save. I'll explain that in a second, but that's what that stands for. And make sure it's capital S. We want to install React and then React DOM. You guys got that? So an absolute minimum, we need to install those two packages to even create a React project. Okay, there's a lot more we need to install for more advanced React projects, especially like Redux and stuff like that. But for the most basic level React project, we have to install at least that.
What does the -s do?
It stands for save, which means it will add the dependency to your package.json right here. So you see how this is now on line 34 and 35? Those weren't there until I ran the installs. But the -s is what specifies to add them there. Okay?
Can you show the
Yeah. So once we install this, we need to install a few more packages before we actually write any code. So let me know when you guys are ready.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so here we're installing what's called transpilers. So the idea behind this is that the code that we write in React, we don't actually run that code because that code is written in a language called JSX. And JSX is it's not pure JavaScript. It's like a variation of JavaScript. However, browsers can't run JSX because it's not pure JavaScript. So what we need to do is transpile our code, our original source code, into transpiled code, which becomes pure JavaScript. Does that make sense? So these transpilers do that for us. Okay, that's what Babel is doing for us. So go ahead and install those. The -d stands for dependency, not save. Or, I'm sorry, dev dependency. So in other words, we don't want to save that in the regular package.json. We want to save this in what's called a dev dependency object. Because unless we do that, these files will deploy to the actual server, and we don't actually want that. These are just tools for development. We don't want to deploy these tools. Does that make sense? That's hence the term dev dependency, as opposed to just regular dependency. So that's what these babble transpilers are doing. Okay? We got to do one more, then we're ready to begin. So npm. So now we got to install Webpack locally. So we installed it globally first thing we did before we started coding. Now we got to install it locally in the project. This is a little confusing, but you need Webpack in the project as well as globally on your machine. Okay. Now what Webpack does is that it runs the transpilers for us in addition to like a handful of other things. But within the context of what we're going to use it today, Webpack will actually run the transpilers. Okay, so you need to somehow run the Babel code, and Webpack is the most popular way to do that. There's a couple ways you can do it, but Webpack is the way that most people use in a React project. Okay, so Webpack is the tool that runs the Babel transpilers for us. Good?
What if we skip the global Webpack step?
It'll just tell you when you try to run it, it'll say you need to install it globally. You'll just get an error warning saying you forgot to do this.
I got an error saying I need to install pair dependencies.
You sure that's not a warning? That's just a warning.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what, yeah.
Don't worry about that. Errors are more obvious, like big red text saying it's not going to work. So, okay. So far, so good? Okay. So now that's at a bare minimum, we've installed everything we need to create a React project. So now we can go ahead and do that. So inside our Node Express project, let me just move this over. Typically, what I see in professional React projects is there's an SRC directory where all the React code goes. That's a typical React architecture. So we're going to begin our project by creating a new directory called SRC. Okay, we're going to cd into it. And then we're going to create our first React project. Did you book the room?
This is the React JS.
Oh, yeah, come on in. Let me just pause this video.
Sorry, we're waiting.
Okay, so within our SRC directory, we begin writing our React code. Typically, what you see is a sort of like an entry point React file, typically called index. So we're going to create an index.js like that. And here it is, src index.js, and this is where we begin our React code. So like I said, we're building this up from scratch, from the bottom. So these days, this is not typically how React projects are created. There's all these tools now where it just gives you a React scaffold, including Turbo. But like I said, it's good to know everything from the bottom up. So from a conceptual basis, you know where you can make changes and where things can be adjusted on your end. Okay. So first thing we want to do is import React. As well as a submodule called component from the React bundle, the React library, excuse me. We're also going to import the React DOM. And here we're going to write our first what's called a component. A React component, it's kind of like a custom HTML component, custom HTML tag, I should say. Where basically you define a tag, quote unquote, and then you determine the actual visual contents that show up inside that tag. You can kind of think of it that way for now, and that's pretty accurate, except a component has a lot more functionality than just an HTML tag. But at first, you can think of it that way. So we're going to create our first component. We're going to call it app. And the extends it's a subclass. It's subclassing from the React component submodule right here. Okay. Oh, this notation is ES6 notation, by the way. We're writing right now what's called ES6 JavaScript, and this is a feature of ES6 where you can import submodules from an npm. Okay. Every React component has to have a render function, which is where we determine the visual contents of your component. So here's where we decide what literally shows up. Okay? And this is going to be basically HTML, but it's literally JSX. Okay, so here we're going to write some code. Okay. Whoops. So as you can see, we're just determining the actual visual contents of this component, right? And it's practically HTML, but line 7 is literally JSX. You should be aware, okay? And then we're going to use the React DOM to call a function called render. Okay, the most important thing right here is this spot right there where it says app. You see how it looks like an HTML tag? So this is what I meant by we're basically creating custom HTML components. For all intents and purposes right now, that's what we're doing. Okay? React is a lot more than that, but you can think of it for now as you're creating your own custom HTML component, and we're rendering that component right here. And we're rendering this component called app in the document. Okay? If you look at this document get element by ID line, this is just regular plain vanilla JavaScript. So the document is going to look for that root tag or the div with that root ID and then inject this code. So if you go back to your views directory right here, you'll notice that tag doesn't exist. So nothing will show up. So in here where it says my React project, let's give it the corresponding root ID. And then what React will do is it will find that div and then insert the contents that you determine in the component. That's how it works. Okay? That's why it's called the entry point. Make sense? So now if you remember what I said earlier, we can't run the React code directly because JSX is not real JavaScript. So now we have to transpile, and that's done through Webpack. So what we have to do is set up our Webpack configuration. Okay? So make sure you go back to the root level of the project, right there. And in order to set up our Webpack configuration, we got to create a file called webpack.config.js. So we do Webpack, like that. We just create that file. Okay? Now here is where we will set up all those Babel transpilers. So do you remember what I said a few minutes ago about how Webpack runs the Babel? Right here is where we actually set all that up. Okay? Now I'm not going to go through the minutiae here because it's really not React specific. For now we're just going to use some template code that I prepared for this demo. So if you go to the actual meetup page for this demo, you'll see right here the Webpack config file. So go ahead and find that, click on it, and that'll be like the most basic Webpack config that we can use for React. Okay, so here it is. Go ahead and just copy all this. It's only 37 lines, so it's not that bad. And then paste it in here. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but I will go through the parts that really, really matter. Line 6, as you can see, is a reference to the index our entry point index file. That's where our React code begins. Make sense? What that's going to do is transpile the code away from JSX into plain vanilla JavaScript and then insert the output into here, line 10. Okay, line 10 determines where the results will go. You guys with me? Does that make sense? And that has to run before we test our React code, because right now our React code isn't runnable. So we have to go back to our root directory and simply run Webpack. Actually, it's you want. Let's do -d. No, let's just do Webpack. Right. Now it's done, and it worked. Okay, all these green lines means it worked. Okay, if it didn't work, you see a bunch of red lines. It just transpiles the code. Now, what's really important, I really should have opened the file directory beforehand, is if you look here, that was the code that was just generated right now. Okay, and to really hammer home that point, I'm going to remove this. So it's gone, right? And I'm going to run Webpack again. Except don't look at the console. Look at the left side. You see where it says public? You guys see that? Watch what happens. You see how it inserted the dist directory? So it compiled that code according to the transpiling process that we specified in the Webpack config. Okay, that's called transpiling. Okay, so all those specifications are down here. And like I said, you don't need to really worry about this. You can literally just reuse this Webpack config as much as you want. There's a lot of stuff I stripped out in a production Webpack config. So this is like the most minimal Webpack you can use for a React project, and it should work. Okay.
So to run the webpack config.js, you just type in webpack.
Yep, that's it. If you ever want to make changes to this config, you can kind of make sense of where the pieces go, right? Like let's say you want to change the name of your entry point, that changes here. More commonly, you might want to change the name of the location of the output directory. That happens here. That's a more common change. Okay? Webpack is very powerful. It has a lot of features that I just didn't even scratch the surface on here. This is just sort of the beginning of Webpack. You have a question?
Yeah. When trying to install Webpack, I got some kind of prompt saying one CLI for Webpack must be installed.
Oh yeah, I forgot. That's a recent change they made. Yeah, what another annoying thing about Webpack is they're just constantly updating one now. So you want to do sudo npm i-g webpack CLI. That they recently added that, so I forgot. Thanks, Brittany. Sorry about that. One of the common complaints about React development in general is that the packages change so frequently. Like this demo, I couldn't have run this demo even a year ago. There are changes happening all the time. So you know, that's just sort of the price you pay, kind of. Like you just have to deal with that. That's just the reality of React development.
But we'd be able to use like the same package.json file and transfer it over. Is that common?
I wouldn't recommend that. Package.json is usually specific for each project. So that should take care of that problem. So sorry about that. Let's go back to this. So now we have our transpiled code in here, right? So what we want to do is insert the JavaScript in our HTML template with that code. So going back to our index mustache, that's why I left this guy behind, so we can just reuse this. The public directory is implied, so we don't need to write that. And then we do dist, and then bundle, and then app.js. So this just happened to be the same already. So now this will actually execute the React code, assuming we didn't make any mistakes. All right, so let's give it a shot. So we head back here, run the dev server. Okay. So this means I made a mistake. So chances are I have a typo somewhere. So let's find it. Yeah, I made a very silly mistake. So I apologize. It's funny that when you go this like granular, like little things just like escape you. The render code needs to return the div. So that means everyone else in this room also make the same mistake. So my sincere apologies. So it should be like this. Totally my fault. Sorry about that. So what that means now, this actually is a good opportunity to point something out about Webpack there. Like we can't reload the page right now. We have to recompile the code, right? Because the current compiled code is still wrong. So we have to recompile to generate the right version. You guys with me? So we have to reload the Webpack. Make sure we see these green lines. I kept the server running, so we should be good to go. And there's the entry point. Okay? You guys got that? Brittany? Esmeralda, that was your name?
Mm-hmm.
You got that working?
I got lost, so I'll just catch up.
Okay. What about you, Mel?
Same thing, notes. I've been downloading, so I've been taking notes and watching while catching up on parts.
So it's important to understand that sequence of workflow where you got to make a change and then recompile, right? But that can be kind of cumbersome if you're making a lot of changes, which is what you normally do, right? So really what you want to do is here, instead of just running Webpack every single time, we can do Webpack -w like that. That W stands for watch. So what that means is whenever you make changes, it'll automatically recompile. So you don't have to like remember all the time. Make sense? So now if I want to make a change, like right here, right? I saved it, and then the watch flag should recompile. So you see how it just popped up again right here? That's the watch flag doing its thing. So now I can reload, and you can see the console log right there. Okay, so it reflected the changes. So typically I run the watch flag so I don't have to remember all the time to do this, that, and the other. That's a typical React flow. Okay? So what we want to do now is we want to create components to render inside of here. We want to nest components. So normally what happens is that people or developers, React developers, create a whole series of components, several dozen components, which all then render inside of a single entry point. So typically you want to have one entry point which renders the components of your application. You with me? So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's create another component. I'm going to create a new directory in the src called components. I'm going to cd into that. We're going to create another component called jobs. This will be the one that lists a bunch of jobs, right? Like a, need a babysitter, need a dog walker, or whatever. That's going to show up in here. Okay. And then I'm going to create another component called index. That's actually not a component. This is going to be just a simple file that we use to export all the components. Okay. And then go back to the root directory. It's always good to just stay here. Okay, so here's our jobs component. Now we can start writing our actual application-specific code. All right. So we import React, same as before. Going to import component as well. I want to create a class, a component called jobs. This time, don't forget the return. Just do that right away. Now, one thing you may have noticed is I did not import the React DOM. The React DOM is only needed for the entry point. The React DOM is the only thing that actually interfaces with the HTML. Everything else should happen from nested components. So we don't want to do a React DOM render here. That would be kind of a weird architecture. What we want to do is simply export the component. like that, so that we can use this component inside of other components. Does that make sense? So, I want to start simple. All right. And if we go back to our entry point, all the way back to the entry point, we can now import that jobs component and render it in here as a nested component. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's import the component. Is my file path correct? Components. Yeah. Okay. Now, like I was saying earlier, a component is essentially a custom HTML tag. So instead of all this, we can just do that. Render it as an HTML tag. And we can wrap HTML around it, whatever. You can treat it like HTML for now. Okay? And then like before, we have to rerun Webpack, right? I turned it off, so I'm going to relaunch it, recompile, so that the new component is now incorporated into the build. What's typically called the build or the bundle. Okay? Those are typically used interchangeably. So now if I reload the page, this is the jobs component. Good? So right away, like you can kind of see how React can get pretty involved. It's not a beginner level thing, right? Just to do something simple like this takes a lot of like know-how. You're pulling in a lot of tools. You have to understand how the build process works, how the workflow goes. It's not a beginner thing. I mean, this is clearly not a sophisticated project. But just to get this even up and running, like I made a mistake today, right? Like it takes a lot of know-how and interlocking pieces that's not really intuitive. Like using babble loaders is not intuitive. Writing JSX is not intuitive. So it takes a lot of understanding how these pieces work and repetition, obviously, like anything else. Okay. So let's go ahead and keep on building off this. So components typically maintain what's called state. And state is where the data is basically stored in a component architecture. So we want to set up the state of this component. This is a ES6 constructor. I'm not going to get too much into it. That's not a React concept. But this part is the state. Every React component can maintain a state if you wanted to. It doesn't have to, but if you wanted to, you can maintain the state right here. And that's where you store the data. So if we want to have a jobs array, that's where it should go. Okay? And I'm going to list 3 basic jobs, which are going to be JSON objects. So title, okay, you guys can kind of make sense out of this, right? So. Okay, so we're maintaining data in the state. One important thing to recognize here is that there's nothing visual. This is raw data. So there's no HTML, no JSX, none of that stuff should be here. This is raw JSON, okay? So what we want to do now is render this data in the components. So I just made another mistake. This is in the app component. I thought I was in the jobs component. This really belongs in the jobs component. So let's take all that out and put it in the jobs component. Just copy and just cut it and put it in here instead. Because these are jobs, right? So it belongs in the jobs component. Okay, the first thing we want to do is render a list. Let's get rid of that. Let's render an ordered list. This is a sample job. Let's just make sure this even shows up first. And then once we confirm that this shows up, we'll get these jobs inside that list. So I have Webpack watching the whole time, so I don't need to recompile, theoretically. And this is a sample job. Okay, so that worked. So now let's get the actual data jobs rendering in here instead. Okay, how are we doing so far? Good, JP?
Almost. Can I see what your
Yeah.
jobs file looks like?
With me? Good? I'm sorry, was it Mark? Is that,
Yeah.
how are you doing?
Yeah, also.
Okay, so this is just visual confirmation, right? So now let's get these jobs actually showing up in this list instead. And we're going to use an ES6 function called map. So inside here, we want to render sort of dynamic data inside this JSX. In order to do that, we have to open a curly brace. What that means is the data in here is going to be dynamically generated, essentially. So we can do this.state.jobs, right? Because that array has been set on the constructor, and then we can map. That means the dot map function means go through each job in this array or each element of the array, and then here we want to return the visual component. You see the li tag right there? Inside here, we want to render more dynamic content, specifically the title of the job. So we have to open the curly brace again. Does that make sense, why we did that? And that job argument right there is the job specific to that point of the iteration, job 0, job 1, job 2. So each job has a title key, so we do job.title. Okay. Now this is a kind of a weird React thing, but actually I'll leave it alone for now. It's not that important right now. Okay, so that should work now. So once we save the file, it should recompile, and then we should see those 3 jobs in addition to the Okay, so this is good. You see how it says jobs 21, right? So that's telling me that that's where I made my mistake. Okay. That's because I pluralized this by mistake. So what you want to understand here is how to find these mistakes, because this is going to happen a lot. Okay, I mean, it already happened to me twice today, right? So what you need to understand is when things break down, where to look and how to break it down. So this error message right here is saying that variable is not defined on line 21. So whatever I typed on line 21 was incorrect. So I'll look at line 21 right here, and that variable is incorrect. Well, what is that supposed to be referencing? This variable right here. They don't match. All right, so it should be like that. Right? So little mistakes like that are going to happen all the time, right? So you have to really understand where to look to find those mistakes and fix them. There we go. Good? So this is the original sample. Let's get rid of that. That's done. Now, one thing I was going to say earlier, inside these jobs, let's add an ID property, which is simply going to be the index of the array, and that's it. Now, whenever you're mapping through an array in React, you have to insert what's called a key attribute right here. And that key attribute has to be a unique identifier. Okay, so I really could have done title here as well. But typically what it is the ID of the entity. And if you have any REST API experience, you probably already understand that this is going to be a database identifier. That's really what it should be. The reasons behind this are kind of hard to get into right now, but it's mostly pertains to what's called server-side rendering, such that when you render client-side code and server-side code, they have to match up. And these keys are what determines whether or not they match. And if they don't match, you have a problem. It's going to give you a bunch of errors. All right? So now we're good to go on that. So really what we have here is one container, not one component, which is rendering a collection of data. Does that make sense? And if you have any, like everyone here has some development experience, at least from when I asked earlier, you probably already recognize this should come from a backend, a database. Make sense? So what's happening here is that this is going to come from a backend and get inserted into this component, and then the component will render the collection of data. Make sense? That component is called a container. Okay, a component that behaves in that fashion is called a container. Okay, so this is being basically treated like a container. Now the word container obviously implies contain. So a container component is responsible for rendering what's called a presentation component. Components whose jobs are purely visual, which we don't have yet, right? For all intents and purposes, line 20 right here, that is a presentation component because it's strictly visual. There's no data integration. There's no, there's no like API calls or anything like that. It's not maintaining state is the best way to put it. All the state is maintained in the container. That's probably that's the most appropriate way to articulate that. Make sense? So what we really want to do is create a separate presentation component just for this. Okay? So we're going to do that right now. So turn off the server, head over to the src in the components directory, and let's create a job. Let's call it preview. And that will be our presentation component. Now, normally within a React, especially a React Redux project, you see how I have the container and the presentation in the same directory? That normally wouldn't happen. They would normally be split up into different directories. But because it's such a simple project, I'm just keeping it simple. But these would normally be split up into a presentation directory and a containers directory. Okay? Inside our presentation component, right here, let's set everything up again. Same general idea. Okay, for now, this is all it's going to render, and that's it. I don't think I made any mistakes. Okay, so it's just going to show this text, hopefully 3 times. So if we go back to our container component, now we can import that guy. right? That's the component we just created. And instead of rendering this, we can just render our custom component for that purpose. That's better architecture. That's more proper React architecture. So let's get rid of this and render our jobs preview component. It still needs the key though, so just make sure you don't forget that. And we try it again. Normally, by the way, just so you understand why I'm doing this, whenever I add a new component, I normally restart Webpack entirely. The reason is that when you assign the watch flag, Webpack will watch the files that currently exist. So if you create a new one, it's not watching it. It didn't exist when you ran the watch flag. That's why I do that. Okay. So now here we just do everything again. Except keep in mind the job preview, the text is constant. So we should just see this show up 3 times, hopefully. Right? So, and there it is. So that's good. Now we're having it render presentation components from within the container. Right? That's what we want. So now the question is, how do we get the actual text in there? So every React component has what's called properties, right? Data is passed 2 ways in React, state and props. In this case, we're going to pass down properties to each one of these so that the job preview will have a reference to the property that contains all the job's details. Okay? That makes sense? So here, we're going to add another attribute right here called job, and then we're going to pass in this job into that component as a property, which means from within that component, we can now reference that property and just render whatever data we want. Make sense? So inside the job preview, now we can do job equals this dot props, that's the property reference, and then job. Let me just get my battery. Now, if you recall from the container, you will see that each job has basically 3 attributes, ID, title, and description, right? So we can reference these attributes from within the presentation component. So inside here, we grab the job, and instead of this, we render the job's title. Does that make sense?
What's the props?
So this is inherent in a React component. Every React component has state and props. Those are the 2 main ways you pass data. So if you look at the jobs container, this job right here means we're passing down a property called job. You know, because we're using the same word so many times, let's change it up a little bit to make it easier to see. All right, so I'm going to call this current job, like that. Okay? So now this component has a property called current job, which means if we go to the job preview component, this won't work. We have to now reference current job. Does that make sense? So we can just assign as many properties as we want. We can just do that forever. We can just pile in as many properties. Normally it's not that many, but you know, I typically do like 4 or 5, something like that.
So in one instance, you put the return statement had it was in parentheses.
Oh yeah, I'll probably. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's probably better just to do this every time though. Yeah. No, I mean ultimately it doesn't matter, but sometimes I just forget. Okay. So the props thing here, I guess concept, is very, very important. So like that's what we're doing here. We're assigning props to components, and then we're referencing those props within the component itself. So if I reload the page, we should be back to where we were before, right? And that's where we are, right? But now we're rendering presentation components with data being passed through as props. So this is a very important concept here. The container, its fundamental responsibility is to pass off data to presentation components via properties. Okay, that's how it works. That's often very like confusing for beginner React developers, like knowing when to use state, when to use props. And it's not, like I said, it's not obvious or intuitive. Just getting started in React can be a little confusing at first. Again, as you can clearly see, we're not building Facebook here. This is a very simple application, but just to even get this far, requires some understanding of how to manipulate data and where the data belongs and in what fashion, right? So that's why React is typically considered like, it's hard to find good React developers. This is very, very true. This is among the reasons, because again, this is literally day one of learning React, right? You haven't been here before, right? So this is literally day one. This all goes on day one. So imagine just how much more in depth it gets, right? So one thing we're not doing is we're not actually using an API, right? I'm debating real quick whether or not it's worth doing. Do you guys want to see that? To fetch this data from a backend? Okay, so let's see that then. So what we're going to do is create a very basic API. So now we have to go back to our Node Express project, which has nothing to do with React. So inside of our Node Express project, we have a backend route called API just out of the box. It just gives you that for free, right? We're going to remove basically all of this, but these are just sample routes that we don't care about. So let's get rid of all of these routes. Well, there's only two, but let's create a new one called jobs, because that will be the one that returns a list of jobs. Okay, so here I created an extremely simple endpoint which returns this JSON object right here. If you look at the app.js, you'll see that the route is already connected via the API path. Okay, so that came out of the box. It just automatically gave you that. Okay, so what that means is I can now go to that endpoint, to localhost API jobs, and I should see the code that I just wrote. Good? That's going to be our API for today. Okay, so what we really want to do is return the jobs from the container component. Right, so here is our array of jobs that we originally had in the container. So inside the API endpoint, instead of this, obviously this sample text, what we really want to return is the same array. You guys see what I just did there? I just moved it from point A to point B. Okay. And I'm going to change these up a little bit so I know I'm getting the different data. Okay, so click. I don't know, just what do we got? Graphic. All right. So this way I can be certain that I'm getting jobs from the back end versus like cached stuff on the front end by mistake, stuff like that. Okay, so now here, if I reload this, I now have our API, which is going to service our React project in a few minutes. Okay? Good? Everyone with me?
App.json for a second.
App.json, sure.
App.js, sorry.
Yeah. So right here, line 13 is where that's specified. Okay? And this goes to Node Express now. So basically, we're doing like basically full stack development right now. We're going back and front right now, and this is having a combination of both of those skills is extremely useful, right? Because I can just go back to front, back to front, back to front, like within seconds. What used to be the case, because I've been programming now for professionally for almost 7 years, the way it used to be was that you would have teams dedicated to like one area, like your iOS team, which is what I was on in 2012, 2013. You have your dedicated back-end team, you'd have your design team, and they would try to work in tandem with one another. So if I need to change an endpoint, I gotta like send an email, or like create what's called a Jira ticket, and I've got to tell the backend guys we need a different payload for this endpoint because the client side is expecting XYZ, you're sending ABC. And that might take an hour, it might take 4 days, depending on what the backend guys are doing, whether or not they're in the mood that day, whatever, right? So a lot of things can get kind of caught up in the process. I mean, that still happens to a certain extent today. Like the client that I'm working with right now, they have a dedicated backend team, and I got to do stuff like that, right? However, it still helps that I know how to write backend code, because then I can just say, in this file on line 46, if you make this adjustment, it'll make my life a lot easier, right? Those things really kind of move things along. But if you are also the backend developer, it's just easy, just back and front, back and front, back and front, right? And that's if you have that sort of capability, it's becoming more and more the norm that you need that capability, because it used to be like things are sort of converging, if that makes any sense. Like we're still doing JavaScript and back, right? So everything's kind of converging together. It's kind of like all roads are leading to JavaScript. So more and more of the cases, it's not a special feature to be full stack. It's more like you kind of have to be full stack. It's becoming more and more the truth that I'm finding in software development. So going back to this, so we have our API endpoint, which is servicing these 3 jobs. Now we want to fetch those jobs from our container component, right, and then render those. Let's go ahead and do that. So what that means is, inside the container component, we have to somehow set up a mechanism through which we can actually make a request to that endpoint, right? So I'm going to install a library that makes API requests for us. I'm going to use what's called super agent. I like super agent, but other libraries are like Axios or Fetch. These are all very common libraries. I'm going to use super agent. And super agent will make the request to our API on our behalf. Okay?
I have a question real quick
Yep.
about Turbo. The dev server, is there like a shutdown command for that?
Control C.
Okay. If Control C doesn't work, is there a way to manually do it by any chance?
You can just restart the terminal, but
Okay.
Control C should do. Okay, so we install super agent. So now the question is, how do we actually make the request? That's number 1, how, and number 2 is when, right? So inside the jobs component, we're going to set up what's called a lifecycle method called component did mount. That's a special method called a lifecycle method. So component did mount. Okay, what's important to understand is that this method right here is not our method. It belongs to the component superclass right here that will get called by the system at a certain point in time, specifically when the component mounts, or basically when it shows up, right? So by having this console log here, we can confirm that. Did I leave the watch flag on? Yes. So if I run the console, here we have component did mount. You see how it takes like an extra split second for that to happen? That's because the component will render and then that gets called. Okay? So almost immediately after the component shows up, we get the component did mount. Make sense? So right there is a good time to make the API call. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So, wrong sublime. So we're going to use super agent to make that call. That's why we install this. So let's import super agent. And then right here, let's go ahead and make the API call to our backend. So I believe that's get. If you recall from our browser example, it is /API/jobs. Right? That's our endpoint. You guys see that? So that's the URL we want to point a super agent to. So we do API / jobs, like that. We don't need the root because it's the same server, so it's implied. So this is super agent making a request to that endpoint. Don't worry about the query. Technically, we don't need this. It's just good practice. This is just saying, here's the format of the data we're going to get. It's JSON. Now, the actual results are here, and that takes an error and a data callback. I'm actually going to call it response. And then if there's an error, that means something went wrong. Hopefully that won't happen. API error. Just console log whatever went wrong. But if it's success, I think it's body, I think. Okay, so if the request is successful, we should see the JSON show up in the console, and that's it. Okay, don't copy this yet. Let me just confirm it first because I made a couple mistakes today already. So let me just confirm that this is accurate. You guys see it? Right? And don't forget the top level keys. It's confirmation and data. Okay? So we have now successfully made an API request to our own backend. Right? So now we have to take that data and put it inside the jobs container component. Okay? So far so good. So if you look closely, right here, the data key is really what we want. I'll make this a little bit bigger. Right there. That's where the array of jobs begins. That's the payload. That's really what we want, right? So here, what we want to do is parse that out, because that's the payload, that's really what we want. And then we want to take that and we want to insert it into the container state. This is like sort of where the magic happens. We want to take the jobs array and set the state of this. So I'm going to remove this original array. Okay, well, I'm not going to remove it. I'm just going to clear it out. Okay, I remove the contents of the array. Okay, so if I reload, we should see nothing, right? Because the array is gone, right? That's what we expect. However, we're getting data right here, right? So we need to reset the state with the API data, which is jobs. And we do this dot set state. Now, what's going to happen here is the following. Whenever you call set state, which is a component function, React will automatically re-render the component with the updated state. That's why it's called React. It literally reacts to changes in state. This is the most important concept of React. So whenever you make changes to state, the component re-renders with the refreshed data. That is the fundamental guiding principle of React. Okay, that is what React is. That's why it's called React. So if you look at this, you see that? It's hard to see, but this component rendered twice. The first time with no jobs, it made the API request. The API request was parsed, and then the state was reassigned, and then it rendered again. Okay, it all happened so fast, so it's not like you can visually see that. But if you want to literally confirm that, so here I'm going to console log the render for this component, and you should see it twice. And it should be sandwiched around this data, API data right here. You guys with me? Am I making any sense right now? Number 1, number 2, and then data in between. You guys see that? That's how React works. Good? Anyone got this working? You got it working, Mark? Nice. All right. Brittany, do you need it?
I stopped. I just wanted to see how
All right, cool. All right. All right, we'll call it a wrap here. This is actually more than I planned on doing, so this is pretty good progress. I should point out that I've been doing React professionally now. I have 2 clients that I'm doing React work for about 2.5 years, not 2 years, whatever. React is where everything is going. There is no doubt that this is the future of web development. I started out programming in 2012 professionally. I started out, period, in 2010. I started teaching myself programming in 2010. Is it 2018 or 17? So we're talking 8 years ago, so it's been almost a decade. And part of what's important to understand of kind of my guiding principle is like how I make the decisions I do, right? So it's important to understand that I'm self-taught. When I started programming, I had already graduated college. Okay, I graduated in 08. So it was 2 years after graduation, I started learning programming. So the reasons therein were because I wanted to pursue a career where I would be highly in demand. And that's it, supply and demand. That's pretty much the only thing I took away from college, supply and demand. So what I did is I taught myself iOS, because going back to 2010, iOS was taking over the world, and that proved to be a very wise decision at that time, in 2010. If I was doing all this today, that would not be a wise decision, because the iOS labor supply has caught up to the demand. It's stabilized. But in 2012, that was not the case. So being a relatively new programmer, I was less than 2 years into my self-study. I moved to Manhattan, and I started learning getting programming jobs with no connections, nothing. I just moved to Manhattan. Now, I was from the area, so I knew the city very well, but I didn't go in with jobs lined up and all that stuff. I went in with the intention of, I'm just going to hit the pavement, see what I can dig up, and if I can't get anything going in 3 months, I subletted my apartment for 3 months, then I'll just go back home with my tail between my legs and I'll become a lawyer or something. It did not take 3 months. It took like 2 weeks before I started getting iOS jobs, good ones, well-paying ones. That's because I positioned myself in a market that highly demanded my skill set, while concurrently that supply didn't exist because iOS was 2 years old, 3 years old, right? So you can't, iOS developers with more than 3 years experience literally did not exist. Does that make sense? So I was able to leverage that to my advantage. I was getting jobs that I quite frankly wasn't qualified for. And I was able to use that to get better and better and better. And like I told Mel along the way, I made a couple mistakes. There were some rough experiences along the way, but what it did was it got me in the game. That's the important thing to understand. It got me in the game. Once it got my foot in the door, the rest is on me to make it work. Build up my skill set, build up my contacts and my networking and whatnot. But if I was doing, I don't know, at 2012, it was probably Ruby on Rails is the dominant framework. If I was doing Ruby on Rails, or even worse, like PHP, the competition would have been so intense that I wouldn't have been able to break in as easily. I can't say what would have happened, obviously I don't know, but I do know that it would have been harder. That much I do know. It would have been an order of magnitude more difficult. So the question then becomes, what is that environment today? Right? Like how can I leverage that same concept today? Right? And today, it's not as much React Redux anymore because it's not new anymore. That's more the case 2 years ago, which is also, by the way, when I started teaching myself React Redux. Right? I saw the tea leaves, and I started teaching myself React Redux about halfway through 2015. At that point, it was not a household name yet. All the boot camps were not teaching React Redux. But I knew, I kind of saw where things were going, mostly because Facebook was pushing it like crazy, and Facebook runs the planet. So I was like, this is going to be where it goes. Right? This is going to be where it's headed. So I decided to buckle down and invest some time learning React Redux. It only took a few months because at that point I was already a professional developer. So it wasn't like, I didn't need like a year, I needed like 3 to 4 months. But the point is, those decisions are still paying off today. Right? It's put me in a position where I'm constantly high in demand. Now, the trade-off is that I have to kind of read where things are going and make some tough decisions every now and then. So like right now, well, not now, but like in the past 6 months or so, 8 months, I've been really getting good at what's called GraphQL, studying a lot of what's called DevOps on the AWS side, specifically containers and Lambda and Dockerization. These are difficult things, but I have to stay on top of the curve if I want to maintain my competitive balance in what I do for a living, which is contract engineering. I'm always competing with different engineers and whatnot. That's the trade-off of not being full-time, right? If I was full-time, maybe it's a different story, right? Maybe I'd still be doing iOS, maybe, probably, whatever, especially if it's a good high-paying job. But I'm a contract engineer, so I have to constantly stay ahead of the curve. Now, if you're an entry-level engineer, so who here programs for a living? Okay, so that's a fair amount, but about a little bit less than half of you. So the other half, you want to become entry-level at some point, right? Well, that dynamic is still important. In other words, you need to find an edge to break in, right? And basically that entails studying the hard things and knowing where the demand is coming down the pipe. Does that make sense? And that's sort of the way I look at everything. That's kind of the way I look at life. But as far as like my programming is concerned, that's my guiding principles. Okay. So with that said, I am selling classes for next month. That's what these demos are, promotional events for these classes upcoming next month. And this is my platform. This is all the activity on the platform. And next month, I'm doing an intro React Redux. It's 4 weeks, 2 nights a week, 8 sessions. It'll all be here. It'll be just like this, actually. Typical class size that I ran in New York City when I was doing this is a little bit smaller than this. The typical class size is about 6 or 7. So I would imagine in DC it's going to be somewhat comparable. The idea behind this is to build portfolio-ready projects. That's the idea behind this. It's not just to teach React Redux. What else that I'm finding? When I started programming, boot camps didn't exist. General Assembly didn't exist in its current fashion. At that time, it was a co-working space. Flatiron School didn't exist, at least not to the degree it does today. These boot camps have sort of flooded the market with entry-level devs. Now, they're good, but there's just more of them. So what that means is the demand is now higher for you to separate yourself from an entry-level point of view. And I'm trying to service that market right now. Especially in New York City, I would get a lot of resumes when I was running Turbo for React Redux devs, typically from the boot camps or recent college grads, who were good enough developers, but their portfolios just didn't stand out. And what I noticed is that there's a mismatch of expectations versus demonstrable skill. So simply knowing React Redux is pretty good, but there are more and more people like that now. I mean, the boot camps have literally doubled, and I've done research on this. They've literally doubled the college senior graduation level of CS graduates. So in 2017, if there's 100 CS graduates, there's 100 bootcamp graduates. You've doubled the market size, right? And the bootcamps are doing a very good job of teaching market level skills. So there's more Node Express developers, there's a ton of Ruby on Rails developers, and there's more React Redux developers. But everyone's portfolio is kind of, it's not bad, but it's not great either. It doesn't really stand out, right? And there's just so many more of those people. And that's the market I'm trying to service right here, is that by taking this course, we're going to build at least one portfolio level project. So for example, this is a React project, right? But imagine putting this on your portfolio, right? I mean, someone like me can make that distinction. Like I can see that and think like, oh, he knows React, she knows React. Like that's not bad. But if you're an HR manager, you don't even know what React means. Right? What are you going to think when you see this? Right? This guy is completely beginner, rank amateur. We can't hire him. But you might have a guy with a very good, like flashy portfolio, right? Which looks really nice. What's the name of that one? I built this for a client in 2014. This still delivers dividends for me today. This is not React. This is a very simple project, right, from a technical standpoint, right? This is paying crazy dividends years later. This is 4 years ago, right? This is before I knew React, right? So it matters. It matters. That's the reality of my job. I was telling Matt this the other day. I am judged on my appearance whether or not I like it, not my physical appearance, but this. And this gets me contracts, high-paying contracts. You know, $30,000, $40,000. Like that's a typical contract. So, and this is not a technically sophisticated project, is what I'm trying to say. Now, that's not to suggest that I'm just teaching you shortcuts here. Like we're going to build good stuff here. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, but it will be portfolio ready. Okay. Turbo is a good example of that. This is React Redux, and you can tell by this little icon right here that means it's React Redux. Okay. So I'm doing these demos all of August. Since I just moved here, I'm doing a month of just free demos. Feel free to come to as many as you want. That's basically it. Any questions? Anything you want to go over again real quick?
You're here till when?
Come again?
You said you're here like short term?
No, I live here now. I signed my lease and everything. Like this is my new home base, and this is my office. Well, it's not literally this, but I have an office. I have an office on the 9th floor, and I'm basically everything I did in New York City. I'm just doing it again here, and I want to get the courses going. It's a lot less expensive here, so my courses are less than half of what I was charging in New York City. I was doing a lot of market comparisons and whatnot. I'm finding Washington, D.C. is a growing tech community, whereas New York is a mature tech community. So that market has its, all the schools are settled in, everyone knows what boot camps to go to. Here, that's still kind of flushing out. Like apparently Flatiron School just opened here. I did not know that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have picked this building.
And they're on this floor.
Yeah. So I found out that night when you guys showed up. Like that's how I found out. But the fact that they just opened here is an indicator that things are growing in DC, and that's why now is a good time in DC. I think it's also why I picked DC. This wasn't a flippant decision. I didn't just pick up from New York City one day. Like I gave it some real thought. I was down to DC, Boston. A couple people suggested the West Coast. I want to stay out of the West Coast. But after doing a lot of market research in DC, I realized that this is a good spot. It's a growing tech community, very well-educated populace, and there aren't too many tech, there's no single tech company crushing it here. Right? Whereas in New York, and obviously San Fran, that's just common. So that's a good sign, which means if you're going into tech right now in DC, you should be high in demand if you play the right cards and don't study Angular 1, for example. Angular 2, though, I'm finding more and more I'm seeing a lot more job openings for Angular 2, well, Angular 2+.
I was going to ask that. How does React compare to Angular, after Angular 1?
Yeah, Angular 2, right? So Angular 2 is more of it's like a full support framework, right? So you know how we're installing all these packages from React, and in React, different people like different packages. So not everyone uses super agent. I like super agent, right? Angular is not like that. Angular is you set it up and you have everything you need. So you don't need to install a super agent to make HTTP requests. Angular does that for you. They have libraries for that. Other than that, though, it's a similar idea. It's compiled code. It runs client side, so you can run a Node backend with an Angular front end or a Python backend, whatever. Those concepts are the same, but the actual architecture is much more robust in Angular. It's much more full service. Gives you everything. For me, the critical question is which one is higher in demand from an employer standpoint. And right now, that's still React by a very good margin, but I see Angular 2 catching up. I had once thought Angular was a dead technology. Right around 2016, I just wrote Angular off. This is actually coming from an Angular developer. I had done Angular professionally for almost a year and a half. And you probably don't know the history behind the Angular 1 to 2 migration, but it was not a well-handled migration. And so Angular lost a lot of users for that reason, including myself, and we all went over to React. So I thought Angular was just dead. I'm seeing more and more of a comeback right now. Angular is actually, supported by Google, so they're going to put some real juice behind it. Another one is Vue.js. You may have heard of Vue.js. I don't see that really gaining much steam from an employer standpoint. I just don't see enough jobs out there for it. So it's a good technology. It's a very nice framework. It's actually very good for beginners, but it's not like a job ready thing. If you're trying to position yourself to be competitive in the economy, right now the answer is hands down React Redux. I just have no doubt about that. And then moving on, you should throw in GraphQL. That's on the way. So give it another 1 to 2 years. GraphQL will be pretty much mainstream. And then Angular 2 probably will have a pretty solid place in that ecosystem as well. Angular 2 Plus, I think it's up like 6 now, whatever it is. But whatever Angular is now, it'll have a pretty solid spot. So it's a good question. Anything else?
Will any of your demos include Redux, or is it just
I used to do a lot of Redux demos in the city. I mean, the short answer is no. But the reason is I used to do a lot of Redux demos in the city. New York City, and it was just too hard. Like people just couldn't follow along in a 2-hour time window, and like that's understandable. Like Redux is difficult. So to properly really get Redux across to a room of people who've never done Redux, I would need like 6 hours, and like what we did today, for example. Like, this doesn't even scratch like just regular React. Even. So getting Redux involved. Well, a couple things I should point out that are anti-best practice. So like what I did here with this API call, that's not the way I would do it in a professional project by a long shot. Okay, it shouldn't happen right here in component did mount. This should happen through Redux. And this should happen through what's called an asynchronous action via the Redux architecture. And that's done through what's called an action creator. And you got to set all that up. Right? I only did it this way for the sake of simplicity and because of, I don't want to spend 7 hours here, neither do you, right? So this is I just made a quick and dirty API call like this. But from an actual professional standpoint, this is not the way it should be done. I would frown upon this if I saw this in a professional environment. So I really should have pointed that out as I was doing it. I'm taking shortcuts is what I'm trying to say. Okay? But in an actual bona fide course, obviously I wouldn't do that. So yeah, I don't think I'm going to do any Redux demos anymore because what ends up happening is it gets so in depth and so intricate. I end up I'm like dis-selling people. People are like, I don't want to do this. So that's happened a few times. I am here to sell courses, just to be clear. That's what I'm doing here. But if it gets too difficult, people are like, this is way beyond my comprehension. I'm not doing it. So that sort of defeats the purpose. I mean, even today, not everyone can follow along, right? So, but yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Well, I'm glad you guys hung in there for almost 2 hours. Thanks for coming. I'll be doing this all next week. I try to use Saturdays for demos, so I'm going to try and do 2 every Saturday, and then I try to do 2 during the week as well. So the next one is Tuesday and Thursday, and then Saturday twice. And I'm going to maintain that all of August. And yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, let me know. If you have any requests too, let me know. And that's it. Thanks for coming. Hope you got everything working.